Hello everyone, welcome to Wildwood Studio. I'm Sarah, and in this video, I'm going to be making a memorial pet portrait for my stepsister whose dog passed away. This burning is 8 by 10 inches on basswood, and as always, I'm using my Razortip SSD10 wood burner. The first step with this burning was to sand the wood. I do this every time I do a burning. It helps get smooth lines and shading and gives a nicer finish overall. Then I transferred the design in pencil and started burning. I started by outlining the letters using my knife tip pen. To get smooth lines and avoid unintentional scorch marks and other mistakes, I did this slowly on a low to medium heat setting. I worked on this first because I wanted to keep the letters as negative space, and having a border around them helps me to burn up next to the letters without going over the lines. So it keeps the name looking sharp. Next, I moved on to Roger's face. For this part, I worked with my spoon shader pen and started by filling in some of the dark areas under his mouth and in his nostrils. I created the texture on his nose by leaving little circles of plain negative space that give that bumpy dog nose texture. And I also left light areas around his nostrils so that they would be visible against the rest of his nose, which is dark. The fur around his muzzle is fairly short and lightly colored, so I kept my pen strokes short and fairly light in that area, paying attention to where the light made his fur almost white. Leaving these light spaces and paying attention to this kind of shading helps to create depth in his face. I did the fur texture on top of his nose in layers, so I burned the whole thing lighter first and then went back over it to add shadows. The texture here is more visible because of the direction and length of the hairs, and I achieved this with my spoon shader by using the edge of the pen, moving more slowly at first and flicking up at the end of each stroke to create lines that are thicker on one end and come to a point. I do this a lot for fur texture, and it's one of the reasons I like using my spoon shader for fur over the knife tip pen, which gives a much thinner and more even line weight. The upper part of his face is much smoother, partly because it's further from the camera and more out of focus. Also, the darker areas appeared smoother than the highlights, so I used the highlighted areas to show the fur texture that is mostly implied in the darker sections, like on his forehead. When I was shading all of this, my pen strokes had to go in the direction of the hairs, and this is usually not straight or uniform. This is one thing I see with beginner pet portraits, is that the shading of each area will go in straight lines from one side to the other and not follow the curve of the face or the body. This leads to kind of a flat look. A lot of this comes from just looking very closely at the reference photo to make sure the fur changes direction every time it should. It's always easy to accidentally draw or burn something how I think it should be instead of how it really looks, if I'm not constantly paying attention to the reference. I also did Roger's eyes with my spoon shader, but of course the shading here needed to be a lot smoother than the fur, so rather than using the edge of the spoon, I relied more on the curved, smooth portion of the tool. With the eyes, I think highlights are really what sells them, so I made sure to leave negative space in the areas of the eye where the highlights are, or in some cases just lighter areas like in the pupils. The ears were sort of difficult because there's lots going on in there in terms of shape, since they bend in on themselves a lot and this creates shadows. But there was also some changes in fur texture and color. That was sort of an added difficulty with this burning as a whole. I had to balance highlights and shadows with the actual pattern of Roger's fur. So for example, the darker areas still need to have highlights to give them the proper shape, but I also need to communicate that those areas are darker fur. There's just light hitting them, or the reverse for light areas that are in shadow. So with the top of his nose, for example, some of the highlights there are the same shade as the lighter fur sections, but it shouldn't read as a change in fur color, just in lighting. Whereas the transition from light to dark on his cheek needed to show that it's light fur into dark fur and not a shadow. This is another case where it's important to constantly refer back to the reference photo so that the highlights and shadows end up where they should be, and not just where I think they should be, which often ends up looking kind of wrong. Once I got to work on his body, I had the added challenge of burning the fur while avoiding the letters. It's a lot easier to burn something behind dark letters rather than trying to leave the letters blank, because then it doesn't matter if I accidentally go over the lines. Leaving the letters blank also makes it a bit more difficult to keep the fur looking like it's the same length and goes in the same direction all the way around each letter, because I can't create smooth continuous strokes and I often have to pull up in the middle of a hair to avoid hitting the letter. This sort of thing makes it hard to control speed, which is very important for getting the value I want, so I had to burn on a very low temperature and move very slowly since I couldn't move my pen as quickly right up next to the letters as I can in other areas because I was afraid of going over the lines. I also used the highlights in his chest as an opportunity to add texture, so I burned around some of the hairs, leaving negative space to create that texture. I did the same thing for the little white hairs on his chin. I drew them in pencil and burned around them to leave them white rather than burning them to make a line. The hairs on his chest are also much longer than the ones on his face, so I used much longer pen strokes to communicate that shaggier texture. As always, the shading techniques here really come down to two factors: the speed I'm moving my burner and the temperature setting. And with every burning, it's better to err on the side of moving much slower at a lower speed to get darker values than trying to burn too hot and move too quickly. This is one of the ways you end up with unwanted dark spots, and once an area is too dark, it takes sandpaper to make it lighter again, which is much more difficult than going over a lighter area an extra time to make it darker. I chose this photo of Roger because I thought it showed a bit of his personality. My stepdad sent me a few pictures to pick from so that I could help him decide which one would work best, and there were a few that were more serious, straightforward portraits, but I always prefer pictures of pets, or any animal really, where you feel like you're getting a glimpse of kind of who they are. Also, it's just a very cute dynamic pose, so I liked it for that reason as well. The last step in burning this was to add his whiskers, which I did using my knife tip pen. Again, I did this on a low to medium temperature and moved fairly slowly because I wanted to make sure I got thin, consistent lines with no scorch marks. Then I added a clear coat and it was ready to go. Here's a picture of the finished burning. As always, please let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want to see more of my work, you can check out my Facebook page or follow me on Instagram. Also, please make sure to like this video if you haven't already, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss all my future art videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.